many Americans, success means money, and money means success, and that seems to be super the case on Wall Street. That's why even after the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression, a job at a top-notch investment bank still holds a lure for many young Americans starting their professional lives. But is working on Wall Street really worth it? For tonight's Conversations with Great Minds, I'm joined by someone who lived the life of a Wall Street millionaire and left it all behind. Sam Polk spent most of his 20s living and working as a trader for a high-powered Wall Street investment firm, actually a series of them. But at 30, he decided to leave the world of finance for good. Since then, he's become a successful nonprofit entrepreneur and has written about his time on Wall Street for the New York Times and Forbes magazine. Sam joins us now from our Los Angeles studio. Sam Polk, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
Thanks for joining us. You talk in your piece about working on Wall Street and actually your dad's influence getting you into finance. What got you into Wall Street? How did that happen?
Well, I think it started really early. I came from this house that was sort of lower middle class, and my dad sort of was a salesman that kind of lived paycheck to paycheck. My mom was a nurse. But my dad was always talking about this future when he would hit it big and he would make $1 million. And so from a very young age, I sort of, grew up in this environment where there wasn't enough money and sort of had this belief that money would fix everything. I also think that there's something about my family in particular that's important, which was, my parents were good in a lot of ways, but one of the ways they weren't was that they both had pretty crazy tempers. And so I grew up sort of afraid and nervous and really insecure. And so that fantasy life that Wall Street represented was sort of in me from an early age.
So you're as a consequence of that, do you think that your driving for more and more money on Wall Street was a way to compensate for that fear, that insecurity, that...
Well,
Go ahead.
Absolutely. I mean, I was always, from a very young age, I was trying to compensate. And first it was with drugs and alcohol and sort of being a tough guy. I became a wrestler. But then I got onto Wall Street. And, by the time I got onto Wall Street, I was actually sober from drugs and alcohol. And I started to really realize that, I'm not an expert, but the way that I was using money and power and success had a lot of similarities to the way that I use drugs and alcohol.
For example? How so? Sam, can you hear me?
Now I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, great. What were those similarities? How did that work?
Okay, so the thing about being an addict, right, is like you have all these great stories about why drugs are great, but in the end, after a while, it's sort of a miserable experience. And on Wall Street, it sort of quickly became the same thing. So I'd be on Wall Street and I'd be making more money than I ever had thought was possible. And, there's all these sort of accoutrements of being a successful Wall Street trader, which is like, I'm 25 and I can go to any restaurant in Manhattan and I can go to any ball game that I want to go to. And whenever I fly in from the airport, there's a black car waiting for me with my name on it. And it was this sort of tremendous feeling of power. But at the same time, there was another side to that, and that was that no matter how much sort of money I made, I was always sort of consumed by jealousy. I would look at the guys next to me that were making, I'd be making 1 million and they'd be making 10 million, and I would just be eaten up inside with envy. And after a while, after a couple of years of bonuses where, the bonuses would shoot up in size, but the feeling would stay the same. And I started to realize, just like how there's never enough cocaine, there was just never enough money. That cocaine never fixed what it was that I was trying to use it to fix.
When we look at these huge disparities in wealth in the United States, well, and around the world, do you think it's possible that the billionaires, multimillionaires who will even corrupt political systems in order to make more money, who will poison communities to make more money, who will endanger the future of planet Earth to make more money, that it's not just like good old-fashioned sociopathy, or it's not you know, we used to think, you know, good business sense or something, that it's really an addiction or maybe even a form of obsessive compulsive disorder where the object of their obsession is money and the compulsion is to get the money no matter what the cost is?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I have come to believe that addiction is a symptom of a spiritual malady. For me, that sort of meant like this sort of brokenness inside me. And that brokenness sort of led me to that sort of addictive personality where I couldn't get enough. And I think to your point that one of the reasons that my story, I think, went so viral is that I was floating this idea that, at least for me, my sort of greed and ambition was really a reflection of sort of a spiritual sickness. And it's possible that, you know, the billionaires who are kind of ruling the world, maybe not as sort of wonderful and powerful as we think, but maybe they're potentially spiritually sick.
And well, I've known a few, and at least one is a very, very miserable person. I mean, just, you would not want to be inside this guy's head. And even though he's got over $1 billion. Society, is it possible that what you were experiencing was not, you know, uniquely Sam, Polk, and uniquely a particular addiction, but really rather a reflection of a societal corruption, a sickness within our culture?
I mean, I completely believe that, and I'll tell you why. I mean, you know, one of the reactions from my story has been, you know, Wall Street, a lot of my sort of friends on Wall Street got really upset, and they said, you know, you're really like attacking Wall Street. And I wasn't. I was talking about my personal experience, but I also know that, you know, what I was speaking about had to do with red carpets, and it had to do with Silicon Valley, and it had to do with the Mega Millions lottery. And I also know that, you know, I got emails from my story that came from all across the economic spectrum, and really people were saying, like, more than anything, it was like, I really identify with the feeling that there's never enough, and this feeling of jealousy of other people. And so to your point, like, I do believe that, you know, my story is just one man's experience, but it is a story of sort of spiritual sickness and redemption. And I do believe that was really attractive to the world, who my layman's opinion is that there is a lot of spiritual sickness in our society.
If that's the disease, or a symptom of a larger disease, what's the cure?
You know, it's funny, it's like when I was 22, well, let me put it this way. Alice Miller talks about these things called enlightened witnesses. And she says really the main difference between a kid who is abused, who sort of turns out okay, or one who turns into just another abuser that's going to repeat the pattern, the one difference is something that Alice Miller calls an enlightened witness. And it's just a person that happens to be around that shows caring and shows you just by their attention that you're valuable. And so that was what I was lucky enough to get. I was 22 and I was dumped by this girl, and I had been using drugs and alcohol for years and years and years, and I was finally sort of broken enough to ask for help, and I met this woman who was a spiritual counselor, and she started teaching me you know, lessons, but really she was teaching me over time that I was valuable. And so you ask, like, what is the solution? And a lot of people have been asking me that. They're like, Sam, you know, why don't you kind of come up with a big policy solution, or why aren't you in Congress? And the answer is that, like, there's a lot of smart people saying really smart things, and I don't think that I'm particularly smarter than them. What I do have inside me is like a different consciousness that has been given, I believe, from sort of my interactions with this teacher. And so to your answer, like, somehow consciousness has to change, whether that's an awareness, whether that's us sort of all facing our historical past, or us all kind of coming to get a sense of rediscovering our value and our connection and our responsibility to other people. But how that happens, I don't know.
Well, from prior to the 1980s, the average CEO in America made 30 times what his average worker made, and it was typically his. And then Reagan dropped the top tax rate from 74% down to 28% and dropped capital gains substantially. And now we have CEOs, Stephen Hemsley, the CEO of United Healthcare, has taken over $1 billion from a company that's supposed to be providing health insurance to people. The guy before him, Dollar Bill McGuire, took $1.6 billion, as I recall. And these guys aren't unique. I mean, there's 10 people on Wall Street who took more than $2 billion each last year. At some point, don't we have to ask the question, what could any person possibly do that is worth compensation of $1 billion, number one? And number two, if we think that might be fueling an addiction that's damaging to individuals and to our society, might we not want to look at that 50-year period that we had before Reagan, when billionaires were not erupting, when society was relatively stable, when CEOs were running businesses in the interests of their employees rather than the interests of their Swiss bank accounts, and look at policy decisions?
Look, I completely agree with everything you said, and raising a capital gains rate and not having a carried interest and all these, raising the marginal tax rate on the top earners. I completely agree with all of that. The only thing that I'm saying is that policy answers are not necessarily a cure for a spiritual problem. And so if you believe that this is sort of a spiritual sickness, then there might be some sort of spiritual solution. And I'm not the smartest guy in the world. I don't know exactly what that is, but I do know that Einstein said that you can't solve a problem with the same consciousness that created it. And I believe that we are sort of being led by this sort of intellectualism and this belief that reason and rationality will fix things. And from my personal experience, I've just learned that what I needed to come back to my heart and rediscover sort of my humanity and rediscover my responsibility to everybody else. And I don't say this as some sort of like moral hero. I just mean that, the key thing about addiction, right, is you only see the world through these lenses, right? And you're only looking for what's good for you and to get more and to get more. And in order to sort of deal with that addiction, something has to change inside you so that you can open up that perspective. And somewhere that's missing in our world. And if you think that a higher living wage, which I am for, will fix that, I'm all for that. I just don't know that. I guess my opinion is that it's deeper.
Yeah, that's brilliant and insightful. It's I want to get into how you have reinvented your life and this extraordinary charity that you've put together, and how you're addressing that spiritual sickness in the way that you're living and conducting yourself, as well as what you're doing, in just a minute. More of tonight's Conversations with Great Minds with Sam Polk after the break.